Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had the chance to stretch your legs. I know it was a short break, but recharge for a few moments. I'm very pleased to introduce you to our next presenter, Catherine King. Catherine is a very experienced BSL to English interpreter who brings over 25 years of rich and varied practice across multiple fields, including academia, social services, the medical and legal sectors, and the arts. She's worked on everything from main stage performances with the National Theatre of Scotland to stand-up comedy and educational and legal contexts, which gives her a truly broad and unique perspective on our profession. Her session is titled Navigating Change, Personal Transformation and Professional Identity in Interpreting, and it invites us to reflect on the moments within our own lives and when they shift, whether that's due to health, career transitions, or changes in our personal identities, and how those shifts inevitably influence the way we work. Catherine will help us to consider how we maintain a sense of stability when circumstances are changing and how we can bring adaptability into our roles in a way that serves both ourselves and the communities we work with. Her insights are especially relevant for anyone experiencing or supporting others through periods of transition, uncertainty, or growth. If anything resonates with you during the session or sparks a question, please put your reflections in the chat as we go along. And don't forget, you can find all of Catherine's full information, a bio, as well as additional resources and recommended reading on the platform. Let's give a warm welcome to Catherine King and get ready for a session that promises to be both reflective and inspiring. Over to you, Catherine.
Wow, that's quite something to hear all of that. Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you. Yeah, way to have me as the first live person after an incredible keynote. Cheers. So, um, so let me just check this. I have control, right? First of all, I want to thank the committee for allowing me to present today. It's an absolute honour to be with you all. And secondly, I've taken to doing this now in presentations. I want to begin with a language acknowledgement. BSL is not my first language, it's not my family language, and I'm incredibly grateful for the teaching and the community that I've been given by so many deaf people over the years. I'm only here in this conference, but also in this job because of your trust and courage that I will always work with you and for you to the best of my abilities. Now, I'm going to begin. I do promise you I'm going to begin, but I want to offer a couple of trigger warnings. One is the experience of being diagnosed with and living with a chronic illness. And the other is potentially the more difficult one for those of us who are translators and interpreters, and that is translating Shakespeare. So I want to talk about becoming. I want to talk about being an interpreter. I want to talk about being a woman. I want to talk about being in menopause. I want to talk about being a middle-aged woman. I want to talk about being the one who supports. I want to talk about being the one who offers strength. I want to talk about being an artist. I want to talk about being disabled. And as I said, I want to talk about becoming. Back in 2015, I started studying a Master's in Education at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland here in Glasgow. I remember sitting in the corridor outside the interview room, and there was a notice on the door which said, "Quiet, auditions in progress." And a shiver of fear went through me at the thought of being auditioned. Interviewed, yes. Auditioned, no. Because that's something a performer does. And what I do is not performance. I'm not an artist. I'm an interpreter. Therefore, I should be interviewed. And that, at the time, felt like a very clear and important distinction for me. In the middle of that course in February 2017, I had a brain lesion. It came with absolutely no warning, and it took my eyesight from me for about 4 weeks. And it left me with residual eye problems for a year. The neurologist said, "Don't worry, it'll probably be multiple sclerosis, but at your age, it will probably never happen again. So just go ahead with your life." And I did. In my final master's year in 2018, I worked with the head of the Masters in Classical and Contemporary Text programme at the Conservatoire. Dr. Mark Silberschatz. And we embedded 3 interpreters, including myself, in his adaptation of Shakespeare's Henry V. I took on the additional role of Director of Performance Interpreting in the production. And it was the first time that I had even really considered the idea of something called backstory, the creation of a character when you're a performance interpreter. And it was done out of the need to satisfy basic questions around why interpreters were on the stage and in the world of the play. So we tried to answer the question, who am I in this space? And the question came actually from the deaf community in many ways. The deaf audience in Scotland had for decades been advocating that accessible performances should be done differently, better, and offering something that wasn't just equitable, but creative and engaging. This was my first opportunity to answer that demand. The woman you see on the right is Natalie MacDonald, and she's a well-known interpreter here in Scotland. She's doing duty there as a floozy, as a harlot in a tavern. And this is Yvonne Strain, another well-known interpreter in Scotland. And she is not only interpreting the argument in the pub, she's also breaking up the fight. Just so that we're clear, you don't need to know anything about the plays I'm going to talk about, so you can park any worries about Shakespeare. Just relax. This particular play has 3 worlds within it, and I placed an interpreter in each of them. There's the English court with the English king, the French court with the French king, and then the pub, which usually had soldiers in it. I was in the rehearsal room 95% of the time. The battles were all replaced with songs, as you do, and I translated all the songs and created videos for my other 2 colleagues to follow. We had specific rehearsals so that we could make sure that we were offering a simultaneous translation, which was exact for each song. And I supported the director when we blocked scenes, and I worked with wardrobe to inform costume. I had long conversations with the director about the impact and uses of the interpreter in the space. And now the main approach we took was that the dramaturgy of the scene was the most important aspect to consider. Now, by this, I mean that the presence of the interpreters should make sense. It should be part of the world of the play, and it should work to augment and support the themes of the scene and the play. It should never look irrelevant or tacked on. All of that I was doing, as well as translating the text for myself and preparing my own interpretation and performance, taking field notes for the research in the room, continuing to do my usual interpreting practice in the community, working on the MEd, the Masters, and submitting for that, and raising a 9-year-old daughter. Now, I don't say any of that to boast because, to be quite honest with you, that's pretty average workload for most of the women that I know. I do tell you this to acknowledge how deep in denial I was about what happened to me. At this point, I still had days with quite bad visual problems. Fatigue was intrusive and frustrating, and cognitive fog was ever present. But it never occurred to me to ask for support. 18 months after the lesion and 3 months after this production, I started to feel like I'd pretty much recovered. And then, well, menopause happened. It fell on me from a great height. By the end of the Masters, as I moved into the beginning of the PhD in late 2018, I had grudgingly accepted that interpreting in performance happened in an arts context and could therefore be legitimately described as performance interpreting. Now, right now, that probably doesn't seem like a great leap forward, but at that time, we weren't talking about working in the theatre in those terms. And so it was a great philosophical and personal leap forward for me. So it's 2019 and I was feeling on top of the menopause, steadfastly ignoring the possibility of future MS recurrence. and I started a series of annual Renaissance projects, which over the following 3 years would form the basis of the PhD project, the PhD research. The first of these was called a play called The Witch of Edmonton. My colleague Yvonne Strain and I were embedded as interpreters in this play. And this was one of the, and still is one of the most frustrating productions I've ever been involved in. We had 4 weeks of rehearsals, and until the last week of rehearsals, nothing we tried seemed to work. And we bumbled around the performance rehearsal area, trying every approach that we had learned over the years. We tried standing very close to the actors. We tried standing very far away from them. We tried being upstage of them. We tried being downstage of them. We tried engaging with the actor, and we tried completely ignoring the actor. The actors hated it. We hated it, and the director hated it. The change only happened when I stopped asking the previous question of who am I in this space and replaced it with a much more actorly question, which was, what do I want from these other people, these characters? Stanislavski, and I'm paraphrasing here, would say, I want, I do, I feel. In doing that, in replacing that question, some sense of structure came into focus, and a backstory emerged that positioned us both as Goffman's non-persons. We were felt but not seen by the characters, and we added to the sense of threat that the director had created in a very claustrophobic world. The personal challenge for me was finding a sense of comfort in the physicality that approach demanded. There are certain unwritten rules that we know as interpreters when we're working with presenters and actors. And it usually means that there's quite a respectful distance between you, even if you're placed relatively close to each other. And you're usually standing in a static position. You may move, but you'll continue to be static in that position. I worked to use the stage in a different way. To squat down, to kneel, to move around the stage, not because the lighting needed me to do it, but because the play did. And to hover at the back of the stage, very uncomfortably for everyone, watching the action, but distanced from it. And the point of all of that was to undercut the expectations for the audience of the expected form of an interpreted performance, and to offer something that, in Barba's words, was more evocative and engaging. We also established a rule that the actors could not see us, and that we could be very close, even touch them, and they could not react. So here's me being uncomfortably close to an actor and feeling very uncomfortable about it. But the great theorist Meisner tells us that which hinders your task is your task. And the Scottish response to that is, aye, cheers, Meisner. We played with copying the actors, mimicking them deliberately, not for the purpose of a theatrical visual, but to confound that visual and continually insert ourselves into the lives of the characters. And here is Yvonne doing just that. And you'll note that the actor is staring directly into the eyes of her scene partner off camera here. But Yvonne is using a BSL deaf community cultural response of averting her eyes. And in doing so, she's keeping control of the communication. Again, throughout this project, it never occurred for me to ask for special measures or additional support, even though I know now there were things that could have been done to help. Instead, I again took on the role of Director of Performance Interpreting, as I'd done in Henry V. And I've previously talked about this period in my life and said that I wasn't necessarily living in denial, but I simply was following the advice of my neurologist to continue to live my life on my own terms. And if truth be told, I didn't feel permitted to ask for support because I didn't have a clear diagnosis of something recognisable, something that would inspire offers of support. The biggest thing I was dealing with in 2019 was menopause, which was still not really discussed that openly, and it wasn't particularly supported. In a research piece at doctoral level, you're supposed to have a theoretical underpinning for the methods you're using. And by 2020, I was seeking that methodology and I was stuck in an endless loop of trying to find something that could fulfill three aspects for me. One was to keep the focus on my practice rather than generate analysis of theory. To keep the focus inward on my lived experience of creating in these spaces, rather than anything that was outward focused, for example, assessing audience response or the actors' responses to me. And I also needed it to be iterative. I needed it to be something I could use in the following two projects. Now, I had been repeatedly told by supervisors and far cleverer people than me that the most appropriate methodology for what I was trying to research was practice as research. And I would nod and smile politely, but I steadfastly refused to pursue it as an option. Practice as research in the arts academia, just for information, is a methodology that artists use to test boundaries and experiment with their art. Now, as I have already said, I'm not an artist. On the eve of the first lockdown in the UK in March 2020, I finished my run of my second research production, which was an adaptation of Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale. It was directed almost like a film, with two different worlds intercut. Each time period was constantly being intercut with the other, but it was always in the same space. And lighting supported those changes, those shifts. The action bounced between the two stories, sometimes very rapidly, and these two stories were 18 years apart. We would interrupt speeches with a shift, and story arcs would interrupt with a shift as well. I had to work solo because of funding constraints, and I was once again director of performance interpreting. Now, I had gone into this production interested in quite a technical acting strategy and whether or not it could be useful for our work as interpreters on stage. I wanted to ask the question if a performance interpreter could have an objective or a super objective. Now, a little bit of context. An actor prepares by examining the character that they've been given and deciding what it is that character wants. What's the end goal for that character? That's their super objective. They then work back from that through all of the other scenes to decide in each scene what their objective is that will support that end goal, that super objective. A simple example is a play like Macbeth that a lot of us might know, even just briefly the story. Macbeth's super objective is to be king. That's it. It's that simple. That's his ultimate goal. So in each scene, he has to work towards that goal, whether he's plotting actively with his wife to kill the current king and take his throne, or whether he's welcoming that current king into his home and offering him hospitality in order to ingratiate himself. And all of this work, although the audience may not be aware of it, adds depth and coherence to the performance. So I was playing with the question of whether or not I, as the performance interpreter, could create a character who would have objectives for herself, separate from the characters for whom I was interpreting. Now, we know that most often a performance interpreter moves in and out of becoming every character in a scene. And therefore, whether we're aware of what the actor's objective is or not, we take on those objectives. I found that I didn't have space for an objective of my own in each scene because my head would have exploded or gone on fire. But I could have a super objective across the whole length of the play. And the question became, what was my super objective and how could I pursue that, given that I was so busy becoming everybody else and pursuing their objectives? Now, our adaptation of the play had two characters that moved between these two worlds via a sort of liminal space, a kind of in-between world. One of the characters' super objective was to seek harmony, a family reunited. And the second character, their super objective was simply to cause trouble. They moved between the two worlds through this third liminal space, and over the rehearsal period, that became thought of as the desire for harmony versus the agent of chaos. Now, where there is text, we are there. There is an interpreter. And so I had to consider who I was going to be in that space. Rehearsing with the actors in those scenes, I had found myself often standing in the middle of them, standing between them and becoming each of them as they delivered their text. And there were moments that I, as both an interpreter and a human being, felt very frustrated with them and the complex text. And it led me to reflect that the space between harmony and chaos could either be thought of as balance or tension. I chose the former, balance, and thereafter I thought of myself as an agent of balance, a sort of fulcrum, encouraging both harmony and chaos, because, we know that life requires a little bit of both. So here I am, finding harmony and engaging in a bit of chaos. The character I created couldn't have an objective in each scene, but between the scenes and in moments of silence where there was no spoken text, between worlds and across the entirety of the play, she could strive to find balance and bring it into the lives of these troubled people. It may not have been evident to the audience that this was all happening. It probably wasn't, but it offered a coherence for me and for the other actors, a frame in which we could work together to create the world of the play. I look back on this production as the last time that I felt well during my PhD. The last time when the long 12-hour days were, and the endless grind of translating Shakespeare was, if not fun, at least it was fulfilling and fascinating. In autumn of 2020, and from the privilege of a very safe home, I watched our world on fire. Hashtag Me Too, hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Where is the Interpreter, daily COVID briefings and bleak statistics, conspiracy theories and police brutality, hashtag Build Back Better. And the disabled community's shouted response to that of what about Build Back Better for all? And it was clear that our collective memory would always hold the before 2020 and the after 2020. Now, in this period, I'm reading, or trying to read, PhDs written by colleagues working in my language combination, and they all begin with an introduction, context setting chapter that describes and defines the deaf community, their language, and their culture. And all of the writers are hearing, all of them, and so am I. And it becomes increasingly clear that all these protests have at their heart the same thing: a demand for respect, equality, safety, opportunity. And I'm not contributing to that in my field with this PhD. I don't want to start my thesis by having to talk about them over there, because I'm simply not in a position to talk about we or our. Because I know I'm an outsider researcher. I'm in, but I'm not of the community. And I look at my research and it's built on describing sign language, deaf culture, and how I navigate it, and it all just feels wrong. So in conversation with my supervisors, we agree that while I will signpost readers to other research by deaf and hearing academics that unpacks that, and I will explain my reasoning for the decision, I will not include a chapter that unpacks the language and culture of the deaf community. I have to admit, it felt radical and quite scary. But I found solace when I later read the works of people like Custers and MacDonald and many others. Sorry, McDougall and many others. In December 2020, I was lifting weights in the gym, because that's how I roll. And my right foot felt weird. That's all, just a little weird. And over the next 2 days, it becomes numb. And that numbness spreads up to my right leg, to my right side, my right shoulder, my right hand, my right arm, and finally my whole face. Now, here's a funny thing about being a working sign language interpreter who can't feel their face. It's an interesting proposition. An MS relapse is an odd thing. There are no lights and sirens, no emergency, no rapid response team. It is what it is, and it's happening, regardless of whatever you do in the next 10 minutes or 2 hours or 2 days. The most you can do is an MRI after the fact to confirm the diagnosis and then try to prevent it happening again. My MS nurse is on the phone and she tells me that it's definitely a relapse. And so I now definitely will have relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, and I'll need to go on DMDs. And we'll talk in January after the MRI results are in. If I Google DMDs and I find that they are disease modifying drugs with side effects that give me nightmares for the next few nights. So I have RRMS, I'm on HRT, I have MRIs, and now I have DMDs. I am rapidly becoming a VIP at the NHS. In January 21, the MRI confirms multiple lesions and therefore MS. And the nurse is kind, but there's nothing to be done. 2020 ends my old normal, and 2021 comes around with a new way of seeing and being in the world. Like everyone else, there is the before 2020 and there is the after 2020. On the MS website, society website, I read that I'm now legally considered disabled. So I have to notify the DVLA, who hold my license, and my car insurance, and any life insurance I have. I immediately cancel my life insurance because the terms of it are so restrictive that it's now moot. I don't know what it means to be disabled, for me to be disabled, because I'm walking around and I'm cleaning my house and I'm going to work as I've always done, but I know something is different, just not what that different will mean. And I find myself talking about it probably too often with disabled people that I've known for years, inadequately and inarticulately trying to explain how confusing it is to be disabled, but not want to be called disabled because it feels a little cheeky. Yeah, cheeky. Having worked alongside disabled people for so many years, many of them artists and activists, it feels hubristic to pick up a placard at this late stage and join a fight that I feel I don't have the right to claim. A bit like getting hearing aids and calling myself large D deaf, culturally deaf. The people I talk to about this look at me and most of them just laugh. One of them says, "It's a very strange thing to have imposter syndrome about." The diagnosis feels like a very quiet and slow motion bomb. It causes multiple wounds, but all of them are invisible to the naked eye. So I had made this conscious decision to offer something different with my research, that my thesis would be about me and my practice and my internal process, my positionality and the work that I produce. Practice as research at that point appears to be the most glaringly, embarrassingly logical choice for a methodology, which means I have to then start to consider that what I make is art. And for an interpreter, that's take a deep breath. The philosopher Ryle tells us that art happens when we apply intelligence and innovation to our practice. So it's the care and attention that we bring to our practice. And if that's the case, then I can say I have an arts practice. So I start saying that out loud, practicing it. I have an arts practice. Oh, me. Oh, yes, yes, yes. I'm an arts practitioner. And I work in the arts, therefore I am an arts practitioner. Eventually, I get to the point where I can say it without putting on the fake posh voice or making a face afterwards. But I do feel a little bit like a traitor to my interpreting community. I don't immediately tell anyone out with my close family or friends and research supervisors about the diagnosis. I don't exactly mope, but I do get a little bit mope adjacent. After a while, I tell my extended family and friends and a few colleagues. I get the drugs, I get DMDs, and I start taking them and navigating the awful side effects that they tell me might go away, but probably won't go away. It takes months for the side effects to become manageable, but I keep going. I weight train, I walk, I work online. And when the theatres open up, I go back to work and I keep on studying. Although throughout 2021, I found myself signing up to creative writing workshops when I should have been studying. And I began to remember that I used to write short stories and poetry right up until my early 30s, which is around the same time that I became a qualified interpreter. And I wonder now how that role and the expectations of that role changed me and why I let it. I started to write poetry again, and I sent one of them off to a poet that I had worked with previously, and he gave me feedback. And he later looked me into an online poetry project where each poet wrote one line of the poem and passed it on to the next poet, and so on and so on. So I contributed a line, which means that my name is included alongside a number of other poets as author. Am I an artist now? I began to read a book by Kate Briggs called This Little Art. And on page 63, she describes a common perception of translation as the most selfless art, self-sacrificing. It involves the least of the practitioner's own self, and therefore it contains the least art. I know, but I'm strangely cheered by this quite bleak description of my field. I feel seen, actually. We are taught as interpreters to minimize or at least control the self in our work, to embody the participants, to live in the moment in service to the interlocutors for whom we're working. We were even traditionally taught that achieving invisibility was the mark of a great interpreter. But Briggs sees me, and most importantly here, while translation may be thought to contain the least art, it is still thought of as art. The final project of the PhD was delayed due to COVID, but it rolled around after all the various lockdowns and COVID restrictions that went along with them in February and March 2022. And it was a production of John Marston's play, The Dutch Courtesan. Cue months of trying to figure out how to sign courtesan. We rehearsed with no real COVID restrictions in the room, but our audience was still limited to approximately 20 to 30 people for the performances. So after the two productions of working solo, well, one of them certainly working solo, I was more than happy to find that this time I was not the only one using BSL on the stage, because the deaf actor Benedetta Zanetti was cast in the show. In fact, she was the Dutch courtesan, in this case, the Italian courtesan. We had conversations about whether my character would be her interpreter on stage, and we both agreed she would not. Whether we knew each other or liked each other as characters, and we both agreed that we knew each other, but we were a little hostile to each other. And then Benny began to work with her BSL consultant to begin the translation process and decide which of her lines she would prefer to deliver in English, Italian, or BSL. The impact of that for me was that from her decision, I might have the opportunity to be off stage for a few moments at some points if she chose to perform in BSL. And she did. And I had a few times throughout the long play where I could leave and take a breath in the wings. Now, the dynamic between a deaf actor who uses BSL and English and a hearing performance interpreter who's working creatively is utterly fascinating. And having co-worked last year at the Edinburgh International Festival for a production of Hamlet, working with the deaf interpreter Claire Canton, I can honestly say that collaboration between deaf and hearing creatives elevates the experience for everyone, from the cast to the interpreters to the audience. I would very much have liked to have examined this aspect of the deaf courtesan more closely, but the pressure of and the complexity of the text and the translation, the additional task of field notes and supervision sessions, coupled with the physical deterioration that became evident due to the second brain lesion, it made it also challenging that I'm not sure still yet if I captured enough data to offer a robust analysis. I had a costume as usual in these productions and props for the first time. But there was no set, just a black box theatre space which left all of us feeling quite vulnerable. There was also a text that was awash with sexism, racism, and sexual coercion, all of which set up a great deal of intrapersonal tension that I never properly addressed. Consequently, I was never comfortable with the quality of the translation I produced. But the aim of this piece of research was to look at physicality on stage. I was building on the focus on movement and use of stage that had been a minor feature of the last two projects. I wanted to try and find a different way of being present, something that offered information about the relationships between the characters. Oh, sorry. I'm pretty confident that I have the data on this, but I'm not going to talk much more about this play for a number of reasons. One, because I have yet to properly look at the data, and two, because I found the whole process so difficult that I can't quite bring myself to go back to it yet. The rehearsal process, the cast, the text, my physical health were all increasingly challenging throughout the 5 weeks that we had to work on the production. And the day after opening night, with one public performance under my belt, I tested positive for COVID and I had to withdraw from the whole production. This was the first large production I had undertaken after pandemic restrictions began to ease. It was only the third piece of performance work I'd done in 2 years, and the first large piece of work since my diagnosis of MS the year before. My backstory had changed. All of our backstories had changed. And this particular production took me to the edge of what I felt I could accomplish as this new me. As I said before, a diagnosis of a condition like MS is like a slow motion bomb. After the initial shock of it being part of your life, it continues to detonate stealthily and steadily, even as you move forward with your daily life. On the upside, at this point, I had a legitimate label of disability for the first time, which meant my institution was freed up to offer me a variety of support mechanisms. I had a room that I could go to rest on the long days. And my name was on a very short list of people who were allowed use of the disabled parking bays at the back of the building, next to the bins, where they always are. I was also offered funding for an assistant, someone to help me do physical tasks that I felt were too challenging. But here's the problem with that. I am physically fit. I may be middle-aged, but I can still walk and run and carry heavy stuff. But the guilty little secret that I wouldn't acknowledge at the time I wasn't ready to acknowledge it actually, was that doing the multitude of things I needed to do in the rehearsal room as a performance interpreter and a doctoral student, as well as physically standing up and rehearsing a scene 7, 6, 7, 8 more times, and then move on to the next part of the scene and start all over again. It was at this point just too much for me, given where I was in my recovery. Being able to offload more physical and mundane tasks, like having someone, get me a hot drink or sandwich, or carrying the bag with my script, my laptop, the academic books I needed, the ethical approval forms, the video camera and the tripod. Well, yeah, that might have been nice on days when I'd maybe had fewer spoons available. And it would probably have helped me bring my energy and focus to where it needed to be. But I've always been the one to carry the heavy bags for other people, to get someone a coffee if they're exhausted after a long day of work, the one to do the extra 20 minutes of interpreting so that an overworked colleague could take a break or nip off to pick up their kids from school early. I didn't and still don't know how to be on the other end of that support without feeling like a burden, someone who's less useful to the team, someone who should maybe quietly just go away. There's always a silver lining because luckily the funding fell through and I never had to make a choice. But my God, that bag was heavy. The truth is that I worked so much between November 21 and March 22 that I was exhausted. And then I worked some more. I wasn't running from the diagnosis. You can't outrun a bomb. I just wasn't sitting and listening to it. By the end of the Edinburgh Fringe in August, I had undermined my mental health and my immune system to the point of collapse. And over the next 3 months, I had multiple infections that made it impossible to work or study. MS means that your immune system isn't working properly, and the drugs dampen down the immune system further. So it's easy to catch an infection, and it sets off a chain reaction that can, in a worst case scenario, cause a brain lesion. The MS nurse advised me to take time off, and I did. But I also started to panic that another relapse would happen, this time because of something I have done. And I started stockpiling high dose vitamin D, B12, turmeric, anything else I could think of. I even got a Holland and Barrett loyalty card. The clinical grade fatigue was more than I could bear. I was asleep for 12 to 15 hours a day and still having to take a nap in the afternoon. I became a ghost in my family and absent from my job and my studies. And finally, it seemed that I would achieve that invisibility. I did feel the first hint of rebellion at my situation, that I wasn't going to just lie down and give in to this. And as it's been for so much of my life, the push came from a book. At some point in early 2023, I revisited Kate Briggs' book and I saw a section that I don't remember reading, never mind taking notes on. On page 15, she described a Roland Barthes lecture in which he talks about being struck by his old and untimely body. What to do with it? He recommends forgetting and moving forward. Forget, he says, and be carried forward by the force of forgetting, which is the forward tilting force of all living life. In the margins, I had scribbled one word. Me? Well, that's the question. In the intervening 2 years, there have been peaks and troughs and a glimpse of a new horizon and a new normal. I'm in right up stage of the PhD and I'm working my way through the field notes and scripts of these productions for the first time in a while, crunching data and remembering the way the room smelled and what I had for lunch. And I'm struck by how little support I asked for and how hard I made an already challenging process. Being kind to that me, she didn't know what she didn't know. She didn't know that she could ask for support. And in that context, it would have been a given that it would have been provided. She didn't know that being in a disabled body was a valid place to be and that it didn't make her less of a professional, less of an artist, a less valuable member of the team. And there's a power in knowing this that gives me authority over myself now to create the kinds of conditions for work that the current me requires, to be in control of where, when, with whom, and how long I work. This is, of course, predicated on having had a long career already. And I'm thankful I'm not navigating this as I begin my training or starting in the early years of my interpreting practice. Disability riders have become commonplace in many fields. A document that tells the people you hire who hire you what kind of support you might need, how you might want to put that in place, and that in my particular system, because MS is a contrary beast, the fact that I might need nothing at all. But I have never used one when working in a production. It may be commonplace in many fields. It might be, but it's still unusual. It's still unusual in the interpreting field, unless you work in disability arts. Now, that's a completely different presentation for a different day. I want to finish with a thought around performance interpreters' bodies and backstories. What Snyder calls the performing and performative body. This body, my backstory. What of this body? What of your body? This 55-year-old menopausal, chronic migraine suffering, multiple sclerosis having, curly haired, coconut loving, by the way, mother of one. How do I be in this job on stage, fulfilling my deontological function of being seen clearly, of translating, of offering information on narrative and the rhythm of the language and the implied meaning, but also working teleologically and offering Barbara's evocative dramaturgy? How do I do all of that and not be constrained by, in Barthes' words, this old and untimely body? Bruder tells us that an actor's job is to find a way to live truthfully under the imaginary circumstances of the play. So perhaps I need to commit to occupying each action and moment in these imaginary circumstances, not as an interpreter, not as an actor, but as a performance interpreter, something discrete, something different. As a disabled, artistic performer and interpreter who, while afraid, still chooses to fall forward into becoming. And I'm just going to finish with this slide, which I show at every single presentation I do, because I think that's our job. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thanks, Catherine. It was a very honest session, navigating change and identity in our profession. I think it's always really valuable to hear real-world experiences of how you can adapt to new circumstances, whether that is through your personal growth or health or career shifts, or just simply because of your change in perspectives. And they can both shape the way we do and how we feel the sense of ourselves in terms of our work as interpreters. I think sessions like that are a reminder that we're not just professionals, we're not just an interpreter, but somebody with a set of technical skills, but we're also individuals whose own journey, own challenges and transitions obviously influence how we show up to our roles. I think what Catherine covered has given us a lot to think about. So whether you're currently going through a period of change yourself, whether you're supporting someone else who is, I think there were some particular lines in Catherine's presentation there that really resonated with me. One was relearning life after disability is confronting. And I think for those of us who have an acquired disability, whether that's a visible or a hidden disability, it can change our view of ourselves. And that's what people were saying in the chat. It is validating to hear somebody talking about it and sometimes coming to terms with a change in yourself, whether that's a health change, an acquired disability, or just a simple change that you're going through, sometimes can be a really lonely process. So if there was something from today's session that resonated with you, I'd encourage you to keep the conversation going, put it in the chat. Obviously, the chat's open for questions and reflections and experiences. But sometimes hearing from someone else who's faced a similar challenge can be really reassuring. Your contributions can help spark conversation or offers the support to others in the community. I did notice that the chat was particularly quiet compared to the others during that session. I think everybody was so captivated by what Catherine was saying. Sometimes the chat is quick, and it has been quick this morning, and it is difficult to keep up with some of the comments that are going. However, if you're accessing it on two devices, so want to watch and want to interact, and you have the chat on your second device, somebody posted a tip before that you can press and hold on a particular comment that you're reading, and it won't automatically move up, which was a great tip. And it was actually from the chat earlier. So As we take another short break now, and ask you just to use the time to reflect on your own journey, think about how you've adapted, where you've grown, or perhaps where if you're still finding your way. The pauses, the breaks, and the conference are built into the program for a reason. So don't feel rushed. Step away from your screen, grab a drink, maybe jot down a few thoughts that will help you with your reflections afterwards, or even connect with someone in the hub. So the break is 10 minutes, as all of them are, and we'll be starting it again at 11:35. But as always, there'll be a timer on the screen to keep you on track. When we come back, we'll be joined by Brett Best for a session on negotiating cultures as interpreters, who have relocated to international context, of which I'm one. Brett's experience spans a variety of countries and settings, and so it's sure to bring a fresh perspective on cultural adaptation and on professional identity. Enjoy your break, stretch, refresh, and if you haven't, say hello to someone new in the hub, and we'll see you back here in a few minutes for the next part of our day.